adventures in Wonderland began when I followed the white rabbit down the rabbit hole.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Backside of Water, a podcast that delves into the rich history, awesome stories, and fascinating details behind your favorite Disney attractions. I'm Alex Stewart.
And I'm Annie Rugit. And on this episode, we will be going further down the rabbit hole by exploring the history of Alice in Wonderland.
I have to say, Andrea, I'm very excited about this episode, as I tend to be about every one of our episodes on this show, but primarily because for those of you who follow this show, you may have noticed that in September, it was kind of crickets around the backside of Waterworld, due to the fact that, plain and simple, Annie and I both got crazy busy. A little bit of backstory. I am going to be a papa for a second time. My wife is due at the recording of this episode. We're recording this at the beginning of October. My wife is due literally any minute right now. Woo. So the last month has been us kind of nesting, getting everything prepared, focusing on spending as much one-on-one time with our little guy as we possibly can before we bring his brother into the world. So that was one of the things that was on my plate in the month of September. On top of that, some of you may remember that I am a middle and high school teacher. And around this time, 'tis the season for school to start back up. And because of that, my life went absolutely full throttle insanity, getting everything put together. And for those of you who are not teachers, there's this weird thing that happens to teachers over the summer months. You have 3 months off, and shocker of shockers, you actually get really used to not working a lot. And so when you go from 0 to 75 all in about 3.2 seconds like that, your body goes like full exhaustion mode for the first 3 to 4 weeks of the school year. And so on top of my family stuff, that also came on board. Not making excuses, just saying that this is what happened. And because of that, I said, we need to take a little bit of a break from podcasting for this month, just to gather sanity. And Annie has also been really, really busy. And one of the good news is, Annie, do you want to share about the representation that you acquired?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. At first, I was thinking, wait, what am I going to share? What's good news? Because September had some ups and downs for me, for sure. But one of the ups was I got an agent, a literary agent, for representing me in my picture book ideas that I have. So I'm very excited. Yes. And we are shopping a book out to some publishers, and just my fingers are crossed every day, waiting and hoping an awesome publisher will pick it up very soon. So,
and for those of you who don't know yet, Annie is a very accomplished author already. Annie, what would you say is the book? Well, how many books do you have officially published?
I have, I've written and illustrated 1 picture book and a zine on my own, and then I've illustrated 4 other books for authors.
All right.
So, yeah, and they've all been a blast. I love illustrating them. It's just the self-publishing, it's a real mountain to climb every single time. Yes, so I'm really excited to work with a publishing house where there's a whole team, and I don't have to do every single thing.
That's really good. I'm very, very excited for you, Annie. Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thanks, Al. I'm really excited. It's been kind of fascinating going through this process, because at first there was a lot of waiting from, to hear back from agents, and waiting to, I don't know, just all kinds of waiting for the last couple years. Mm-hmm. And now that it's out with publishers, it's more waiting.
Yeah, so you gotta love that.
But you know what? I've had a lot of practice waiting, so it's all good.
What's a couple months more?
Or longer. We'll see.
What's a couple decades more?
Yeah.
But one thing that we will do is, Annie, I would love if we could put some links up on the Facebook group so people could find your books, because they are awesome, and Annie is one of my favorite illustrators.
Oh,
She's amazing.
Thanks, Al.
You're awesome.
Oh, that means a lot. And I will put some links up. And also for October, there's a special challenge called Inktober that I will be participating in. And I'm going to do a lot of like spooky Halloween-themed fan art of all kinds of stuff. So Harry Potter and probably some Disney stuff. And I'm going to be selling them all for real cheap online. So that'll be a fun thing to share too if anyone's interested. So I will
Awesome.
I will share links with all of that. It's all
I was going to say,
all fun stuff.
We want to see that too. Well, very cool. Very cool. So again, we'll save the other information for the end of the show so we can jump into this episode, I would say.
Okay, yeah, because, I mean, yes, it's time to drink some shrinking juice or maybe eat a growth cookie or whatever we need to get this episode started, I say.
Let's do it.
All right. Although the truly strange characters in Alice in Wonderland are beloved and remembered, they are most definitely creations of the mathematician Charles Ludwig Dodgson, or otherwise known as Lewis Carroll. Now, I find that interesting, Al, because I had no idea that he had a pen name. Did you?
I had no clue.
Yeah.
That's pretty fascinating. Do you know the reason why? Like, was he trying to dodge fame, or was this just something that was really popular to do around that time?
Honestly, I think it was just something that was quite popular, and it was also a way to kind of not be, to not put his own name out there, to kind of hide behind the fame a little bit.
Especially, who wants to know that a mathematician is out there tarnishing his name by writing stories, am I right?
Right. Oh my gosh. But the story's young ingenue Alice was actually based on a real character, and this I also did not know.
Neither did I.
Her name was Alice Pleasance Little, and she was the daughter of Henry Little, a classic scholar. And they moved with their large family to Christ Church, Oxford in 1956 when Harry was appointed dean. So they were the children of the dean there, and they lived and played around the school. They soon befriended Dodgson, who enjoyed storytelling and entertaining the children with fantastical tales.
Man, this guy was really talented, an Oxford mathematician and a world-famous author. Man.
Yeah, he was actually very, very talented and very, honored, appreciated, what would you say? Admired there at
Lauded.
the school. Lauded, yes.
That sounds like a hallowed hall's name.
Hallow Halls, yes. I have to tell you, though, that he's so smart. I mean, one of my biggest dreams, Al, is to be able to add and subtract.
Wait. You don't know how to add and subtract, Annie?
No, I don't. So on July 4th, 1862, Dodgson takes a few of his children, Alice included, out for a boat ride. Don't laugh at me. You're making fun of me, Al. Okay, he takes him for a boat ride.
It just doesn't add up.
Oh man, my pun brain is not on point right now.
It's all right. It's late.
I'll think of some. So he takes him out for a boat ride along with Iris. Or along the Iris is the name of the lake, actually, or the river, with another family friend, Robinson Duckworth.
I am overwhelmed by how incredible the name Robinson Duckworth is.
Exactly. And I'm actually really surprised it didn't get into the story somehow, because it's a perfect name for a character.
Wait, and these two guys can just take children out on boats by themselves without their parents? That seems a little odd.
Yeah, I know what you're thinking, but give them the benefit of the doubt, because these were a lot like uncles to these children. And children didn't have iPhones to play on at this time, so people, took kids out. They entertained them back in those days. And they actually talked and looked at their surroundings, which is something
sounds horrible.
Yeah.
Horrible.
I know.
There was no app to do that back then?
No, you actually had to use your eyeballs and breathe air.
So they were out for a boat ride, and, well, I guess as much as it churns my stomach, I would imagine a picnic or something like that, too.
Wait, why does a picnic churn your stomach?
Because it's outdoors, and it's doing something.
Wow, this is really hitting
social.
home for you. Jeez. Okay, well, Alice was 10 at the time, and she asked Dodgson, who was about 30-ish, to tell them one of his whimsical stories, because they'd already heard these stories for a while. They loved it. So he happily obliged and began telling the story of a little girl named Alice who was bored one day and saw a peculiar rabbit running past with a watch and a waistcoat.
Thus the story was birthed.
Thus it was. The children loved it, especially Alice, of course, and asked him to write it down for her. Dodgson kept note, but started to research the animals and the natural history of his story a couple months later, because he was very methodical, as you can tell, being a mathematician. He presented Alice's Adventures Underground, which was the original name, to his friend, George MacDonald, for him to read to his own children and get feedback. And they were all so taken with it that they suggested he look for a publisher.
Well, so did he... And you guys can both, you and Carol can relate to this. Did he look for a publisher for this?
No, of course not. Not at first. He was too terrified, as we all are, and it seems like a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
But eventually he did. What he did, like any other writer or illustrator, he worked on it more, probably because he was a perfectionist, and added scenes about the Cheshire Cat and the Mad Tea Party. So, we should be thankful that he took some time and worked on it. He even illustrated it himself and gave Alice a copy for Christmas. Then 3 years later, it was published by Macmillan.
So not only was he a mathematician, but he was a genius storyteller and a phenomenal illustrator. This dude was like a Renaissance man.
Yeah, he was. And his illustrations, they have like I don't want to say crude, I hate that word. They have kind of a playfulness to them, but they are really, really good. I'll actually post some to the Facebook wall.
I'm wondering, because I actually read Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, I think is what it's called. Isn't that what it's called? What is it actually?
Yes, Alice's
called?
Adventures in Wonderland is the first book, and then Alice and
Through
the Looking Glass.
Yes. Right? Yeah, because I read the first one, and I think it's the original illustrations are in this copy of the book that I had, and I remember thinking, man, there's something very bizarre about the way that they're illustrated.
Well, actually,
I don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, I know those illustrations because they were in my copy as well. I had an old copy from the 50s or something, and it was it had the original artwork. But that was actually a different illustrator.
Oh, it was? Yeah,
he illustrated the first copy that he gave to Alice, and then they hired another illustrator, which I'll mention later on, and he really... his illustrations were pivotal for that story being a success.
Okay, so here I got my hopes up thinking, man, he's a phenomenal artist,
Yeah.
but it was actually an artist who did those parts.
Yes,
Okay.
but you know what? He worked with Lewis Carroll worked with the artist to make sure that it was very true to his original drawing. So when I post some of that original artwork, you'll see where the published illustrations came from. And you can see that, yeah, it's very cool. It's very cool. And it was really true to Lewis Carroll's vision, so.
Well, and I recall in the beginning of the book, now that you're talking about this boat ride thing, I remember at the beginning of the book, there's that poem by the author about the boat ride and 3 children asking to tell him a tale or something like that.
Yes, you are correct. And in Through the Looking Glass, essential to part 2, Alice's Adventures, there's another clever poem about boating in July under a sunny sky, where each line spells out Alice's full name.
Oh, interesting. What do they call that? Is that an anagram?
Yes, yeah, I think it's an anagram, yeah. He's very clever. He was good with puzzles and things like that.
Yeah, it sounds like he was extremely clever and definitely cared for Alice. Now, did she experience fame once the book was published? I mean, this kind of reminds me of the Peter Pan story. Did Alice hate being famous just like Peter hated the attention when Peter Pan was released?
Well, it seems like regardless of being upset, there was some conflict during the whole ordeal. So before the book was published, the little family broke off their friendship with Dodgson for a while. The relevant page from his diary that he kept so diligently was cut out about that time. And eventually, the Littles and Dodgson mended their relationship, but it was kind of more on professional terms, and it was less warm than it was before.
Always so strange that you hear these things. I mean, you've got the J.M. Barrie situation. You also have with Winnie the Pooh the strained relationship between A.A. Milne and his son, and now you've got this stuff. I mean, it's bizarre how these things work out the way they did.
Yes. And it makes celebrities kind of in a different way than we know them now, which is like, I imagine it was very uncomfortable back then. It's almost like the rumor mill, like, oh, are you that person? Are you just like that story? Because like everyone talks about you. But
absolutely.
No one's actually seen you or heard you or anything.
It is crazy. So I'm curious, like, what happened to Dodgson after all of this took place? I mean, that had to be really hard on him, being so enamored by this little girl and then just being dropped like a hot potato.
Yes. In 1876, he published another book, The Hunting of the Snark, and other poetry. So he kept on writing after all of this. He also published books on mathematics, continued to teach at Christ Church, and meticulously continued to keep his diary.
Interesting. Now, I think that we're also all curious about Alice. Did she go on to do anything of note herself?
Well, being in the upper class, she led a pretty interesting life, but she stayed more or less under the radar than you'd think. In 1880, she married a man named Reginald Hargreaves, another amazing name. And when
Mr. Hargreaves.
Right, Mr. Hargreaves. And when he died, I do a great Katharine Hepburn impression, by the way.
Oh, good for you.
When he died, she actually was left without much money. So she kind of played in these really, wealthy circles, but she ended up not having much money, so she sold her original copy of Alice's Adventures Underground at auction by Sotheby's. Isn't that tragic? Ugh.
It is insane, the things that you hear some of these people doing. It's kind of heart-wrenching. But again, you also have to look at it and say, what is she going to do with it? I mean, it's really just nostalgia at that point. But at the same time, it's like, was it to keep up some sort of aristocratic image or what? I mean, you hear so many of these people living in the turn-of-the-century aristocracy who had zero actual money, but were living like they did, and it sounds like that's exactly who she was.
Yes, well, to an extent. She did come from a wealthy family, but something happened whenever she married Reginald, and, like I said, it's just by the time he died, all the money was used up or something. And also, it was...
So she married for love and not money.
She did, actually. And she never really spoke ill of being the Alice, but I do recall in my research hearing that, she was a little tired of it toward the end.
Oh, I can only imagine.
Yeah, parting ways with this, like you said, maybe she was trying to send it off to a decent place, but she could have just used the money and not the memories.
No, I'm curious, speaking of that, how much did she get from selling that at auction?
The equivalent of $450,000 today.
Wow. But believe it or not, I mean, that sounds like an amazing number, but I honestly would have thought it would go for more than that.
Well, actually, me too. My only thoughts are that maybe because it was toward the end of her life that she sold it, and only, let's say, 60 years after the book was published, maybe it wasn't as classic as it is today. But
yeah, that would make sense.
Yeah, I would think that it would go for $1 million. I mean, that piece is amazing.
That is phenomenal. Well, and I mean, one thing that I want to talk about, because I know that you've done a ton of research into this, I want to touch, because everybody is curious about this, I want to touch on the whole drug culture obsession with Alice in Wonderland.
Oh, let's do it.
I mean, from my reading of it, there doesn't seem to be any true drug references in the original book. To me, it seems more like some sort of weird ADHD-addled journey that a young girl would take down a rabbit hole. And that's where you get all these weird disconnects, especially when it comes to, you can tell there's a huge parallel between the things that Alice learns in school and what she's dealing with in Wonderland. Now, do you, from all of your research, find that there actually is a definite correlation between drug use and the writing of Alice in Wonderland?
No, I don't. I didn't see anything about that. Also, when I really was reading through the history, to me it just seemed like we were in the head of a very strange, clever, imaginative man who would rather create kind of nonsensical words and patterns with language than, just kind of play around with drug use. But I think they start to kind of blend, to tell you the truth.
Well, and it just makes you wonder, chicken or the egg. I mean, because you hear some people talking about, and I don't even know what kind of, and this is weird to tangent down this, but again, it kind of goes with the territory of talking about Alice in Wonderland. There's just such an innocence to the original story that I personally think that came during like the postmodern movement of college professorship of the 1960s that was like trying to read way more into these classic children's stories than were actually there. I mean, for anybody who's ever taken a children's literature course in college, talk about the best way to kill the magic and the mystique of a children's story is study it in a college class. Holy mackerel.
Yeah, I agree. But overanalyze it and
yeah, and I don't think that was a digression, because it is amazing to see that Alice in Wonderland somehow has buried itself into the subconscious of American culture, well, and world culture. I should say at least Western culture. I mean, because you even have, I was reading an article about what is it? The Beatles song with the I Am the Walrus, Cuckoo Kachoob, and all of the references that you have to Alice in Wonderland from John Lennon's writing on I Am the Walrus. That's pretty crazy that you've got even people like the Beatles doing this.
Yes. I know. And especially I think in Great Britain, it's very ingrained in the culture there. Yeah.
I mean, you've got both Peter Pan and you've got Alice that are going into sorry, I'm seeing what you're writing here, and I agree.
No, so okay. Since we paused, I'm just writing that because I realized I didn't put a transition here.
Oh, I see. I thought that you were like.
I'm not
Alex,
saying let's
you're
do.
rambling.
No, I just didn't put a transition, so I want you to know that your next line is going to talk about it's a transition. So.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So
we'll
I'll click in there or click back in and cut. Here we go. Well, and it is amazing to see that does ingrain itself in a culture. And obviously, when John Lennon was growing up, Alice in Wonderland was probably a huge part of his upbringing, along with things like Peter Pan, so on and so forth. So it only makes sense that would become part of his creative process. And speaking of that, it is one of those things where obviously not only was John Lennon and all these other people influenced, but specifically Walt Disney was particularly enamored by this story, especially when he himself read it as a schoolboy. He was absolutely hooked.
I didn't realize he had the idea for that film so early on, or that he was so interested in Alice in Wonderland when he was a boy. I didn't realize that.
I didn't either. I mean, I knew that there was something there that he had wanted to always do, Alice. It was the same thing with Peter Pan, that it took decades for this thing to come to fruition. But Walt Disney actually has this famous quote that says, "No story in English literature has intrigued me more than Lewis Carroll's Alice in Wonderland." He said, "It fascinated me the first time I read it as a schoolboy, and as soon as I possibly could after I started making animated cartoons, I acquired the film rights to it." So obviously it was one of his most prized and sought-after films that he wanted to do.
You know, it came out a lot later, though, didn't it?
Well, and that's the crazy thing, is that the film itself didn't come out until July of 1951.
Oh my gosh. So why did it take so long?
Well, Walt tried to get this sucker made, but do you remember some of his films, the Alice comedies? You might have seen them at the Disney Museum in San Francisco.
Yes, I did. Yeah.
These are awesome because, believe it or not, this is the thing that got him fame originally when he was at Laugh-O-Gram Studios out in Kansas City. That's where he originally met the first Alice. And I would imagine that he was probably playing around with the inspiration from Alice in Wonderland, because these were back in 1920. And as I said, these brought some pretty major success for him in the local scene as far as Kansas City movie theaters went. But in 1931, he bought the rights to the original illustrations for Alice in Wonderland. He considered a live-action film starring Mary Pickford, who was a very famous actress back in the day, but he then shelved it when Paramount's 1933 version came out. Obviously, there was a lot of people playing on the same ideas back then, just as they do now. But he had it in his mind that he would still produce an Alice film. So in 1938, he registered the title with the MPAA and hired a guy named Al Perkins, who was a storyboard artist, and David Hall, who was an art director, to develop a fully animated feature for Alice.
All right, so I can see he's got gumption and he's ready to start working on this movie. But still, it took 13 years before the final release. I mean, what gives?
Well, here's the interesting thing. I mean, if we go back to that 1938 date, for those nerd or Disney film nerds, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs came out in 1937. So that was his first animated feature film. So he was stoked about Alice all the way back during the production of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. So again, we see that 13 years, and that kind of gives perspective to this whole process. That it not only did it take 13 years from the date that he produced his first animated film, but he went back even further than that with this desire to create Alice in Wonderland. So the story reel was finally completed in 1939. But this is the interesting thing. The art resembled the original drawings and was very difficult to animate because of that. And honestly, it was, without a doubt, not very Disney at all.
So what do you mean by that?
Well, again, we have to remember that Disney had established a very charming style through the Silly Symphonies, through things like Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. He had characters that made people smile and feel like the burdens of the world just disappeared whenever you were in the theater. Now, the art that David Hall had in mind was dark and a little grotesque in the artistic sense. And with the gloom of World War II lingering around that time, Walt felt like it just wasn't the right film to produce with that style. So again, he unfortunately shelved it.
You know, this reminds me a lot of, it's like that idea that you love so much, that is so precious to you, that you just, if it's not the right time, you're not going to do it. Or if you can't do it your way, you're not going to do it. That's how I feel this was for Disney. Don't you think?
I think you're absolutely right. That there's, I mean, when you hear, again, the story of how Walt Disney would envision these films in his mind before they were executed, he clearly wasn't just going off of instinct with these things. There were a lot of things subconsciously going on in there. And clearly, when the timing isn't right, it can't have the same magic as it would if it was produced in a different season of life. So I think that's one of the things that made him a true genius, and something that you can't replicate is the fact that he had the breadth and the depth and the scope to be able to see these things and know when the right time to release these films was.
I agree with you. I really appreciate that about Disney. And we haven't mentioned it yet, but the illustrator's name, his last name is Tenniel. So he did the original illustrations. And now that you mention it, that makes sense that because Disney loved this story so much and loved that artwork, that they tried to stay so true to Tenniel's illustrations, which are so far from being like Disney. So...
Well, and again, hopefully when we post those, people will see exactly what we're talking about, the stark contrast between the two.
Yeah, yes. I have to say, though, you know, I can appreciate Disney for putting this thing on the shelf and knowing when the time is right, but from my own experience, working on a project you love so much and having to put it on the back burner over and over again just makes me die a little inside.
Well, and I'm sure that Walt absolutely wasn't happy about this either. But at the same time, as you know from the artistic side, if the film wasn't released at that right time, it's not the right thing. I mean, it kind of reminds me of when somebody puts cilantro in salsa.
What? Ow.
You know what I'm talking about.
Yeah. You know, that happened like one time back in 2007. You'd think after all these years you'd let it go.
Annie, I will never let that go.
Okay, carry on.
Never.
Sorry.
And it pains me to know that you laugh about this. That was the perfect dish. Mixture of sweet and spicy, and then cilantro.
It's a genetic thing, Al. Not everyone thinks cilantro is gross.
Genetic. So you're going to blame it on genes. Anyway, all right, I'm going to let this go. So when production began again, Walt auditioned over 200 actresses.
Whoa.
Yes, which is insanity. Again, it shows how obsessively perfectionist he was in finding the right Alice. He finally landed on Catherine Beaumont, who you may remember from our Peter Pan episode. She was also the voice of Wendy. And they started seriously producing this film in 1947. They had to scale back on the original story since it consisted of both of the books, really. So what Walt did is took a mixture of scenes from both books and blended it together to create a cohesive story, but managed to stay mostly true to the original content, even if he had to lose many of the beloved characters that people had grown up with in the books.
But the film stands out well on its own, I think, even though I love the books so much.
I agree.
The books are by far my favorite, but... this Disney film has such great character design, and Mary Blair's backgrounds are treasures.
Here to that. But regardless of how fun and silly and beautiful the film turned out, believe it or not, it was a major flop.
What? It's one of the more popular films, isn't it?
I know, this is absolutely shocking. It had a huge following now, but the audience in 1951 felt that Disney didn't capture the intellectual humor of Lewis Carroll enough. And because of this, Walt was really disappointed, feeling that there were still too many characters in the film, so it got a little bit bogged down. The songs I'm Late and the Unbirthday Song were actually popular, and as time went on, as we can tell, people really fell in love with this film more and more, which, again, if we look at Disney history, one of the things that's phenomenal is the reason why, and you can even research this, one of the reasons why this film became so beloved again is enter drug culture. So you've got these postmodern college students who are experimenting with substances, and one spreads the rumor that Walt Disney's animation team was doing some illicit drugs while experimenting with animation styles on Alice in Wonderland. That rumor spreads to another person, Boom, now you've got this giant story about Walt Disney secretly doing drugs while producing
films.
Alice in Wonderland. Well, and if I recall, I don't even know what led me down this rabbit trail. Gosh, I was probably looking that up 10 years ago.
Al. Drugs.
Well, yeah, I was on some major aspirin at the time, and but I think that I want to say that there's a Mental Floss, the magazine. There's a Mental Floss article about this. Don't quote me on that, but jump on the internet, listeners, and see if you want to, if that is true, because I think, like I said, I believe that I read that in a Mental Floss article. But you also have these crazy remakes of Alice in Wonderland pop up all the time. Did you ever see either of the Tim Burton versions?
I saw the Tim Burton version. There was another Alice in Wonderland remake or something that used to play on TV, and it was like from the 70s or 80s. Does that sound familiar to you?
It doesn't. Weird.
I should have looked it up before we started this. But that I really loved. It was live action.
Interesting. Well, if for those of you who have any ability to do this, there's actually an episode of I believe it's The Wonderful World of Walt Disney, where it would, or maybe it was Disneyland, the show, where Walt actually has Catherine Beaumont, the voice of Alice, dressed up as Alice on an episode of the show. And they're talking about the production of Alice in Wonderland on the show. It's actually, if you can find a way to see that footage, it's really, really cool to check that out.
Oh, I will definitely check that out. They used a lot of photo references for the film, and they would like draw her from life.
Interesting. Well, I think with the Tim Burton side of things, I like the way Walt Disney did it because it's whimsical. With Tim Burton, it's almost like he was like, okay, I'm Tim Burton, I know what I do, now I'm going to stereotype Tim Burton through this film. It just seems so unbelievably over the top that I'm not going to lie, I didn't even see it.
Oh, Al!
I know.
If you didn't even see it, then you can't talk about it unless you see it.
Well, I saw about 10 minutes of it the other day.
It's okay.
And
those 10 minutes did nothing for you.
And that was 10 minutes I'll never get back ever again.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing with adaptations. You know, the book has such strong setting and character descriptions that, honestly, I think anyone who does a film version, an adaptation of it, is going to be analyzed and criticized. Quite a bit. So, even Disney. You know, Disney did a beautiful job, made it their own, and it was a flop.
Yeah. Oh, without question. When you adapt something, you're inevitably going to lose some sort of magic. Mm-hmm. The only film series that I would say ever nailed it was the Harry Potter series. I think that they did as good a job adapting those films as anybody possibly could.
Well, and you know why? Because J.K. Rowling was on the art direction team.
She was on the set.
And the production team, yeah.
She would sit down there, and she actually had a wand that was 48 inches long, and whenever somebody did something she didn't like, she would expecto patronus them on the back of the neck.
Yes.
With that wand.
I also heard that she would sometimes just use it as like a whipping stick, too, for just a little bit... easier.
That's what she called expecto patronum.
Okay.
Sounded a little less abusive that way. Oh man, I just love it.
To my friends, I'll expecto patronum you if you don't watch out.
And I love that we just got a review on Apple Podcasts. It was like, these guys tangent about things that have nothing to do with Disney. And the answer to that is, yes, we absolutely do.
Oh. And you know what?
So
that's what it's all about.
I agree. We take this wherever it needs to go. So I would say, for the sake of that one person out there listening, let's dive into the attraction that was inspired by this famous story and film adaptation.
Okay, I would love to, but I'm not actually that strong of a swimmer.
Oh, I see what you did there. Dive in. Oh, Annie. Last time I checked, you weren't a dad, so you're not allowed to use dad jokes. But you are a former skipper, so you get a pass on that
Thanks.
Man. So the Alice in Wonderland that we know and love inside of Disneyland was obviously inspired by the film adaptation we mentioned before. Believe it or not, this attraction was slated to be one of the opening day attractions guests could enjoy back in 1955. Now, the original concept for the Alice attraction was a walkthrough experience, as a lot of these attractions that we've explored have started out with as well. Guests would be immersed in Wonderland as they walked from room to room, experiencing show scenes from the film of Alice in Wonderland. The walkthrough experience was actually set to open where Pinocchio's Daring Journey is currently located. But as development of the park continued, Alice kept getting again and again and again pushed more and more off track. Eventually, the attraction would be shelved, but as we have seen happens with many of these Disney attractions in Fantasyland Theater, would take... Wait, hold on. That makes no sense. But as we see with a lot of these attractions, once they've been shelved, they tend to get pushed back in. Now, Alice in Wonderland Alice's attraction would also be where Fantasyland Theater was, but then it would be pushed out even further.
But Alice's Adventures in Wonderland were too popular not to be used in Fantasyland. Park developers at the time knew that Alice would have a presence in the park. They just knew that in order to give her story the attention she needed, the attraction would have to go somewhere else in the land and at a future date. Eventually, Walt would task a group of world-famous animators from his quiver of excellence at his studios to create the world of Alice in his land in Anaheim.
Disney legend Claude Coates would serve as the show designer for this attraction. He would design the entire concept and layout of Alice in Wonderland. Now, Coates was very connected to the project from the start, as he was one of the key background artists on the original film. It was determined that Alice would be a very whimsical, bizarre, and reality-altering attraction. So the use of color and optical illusions helped reinforce that concept throughout the ride experience. To help with this whimsical approach, Disney legend Mary Blair was also brought on board. She also had, as we talked about earlier, a very intimate relationship with the source material as she worked on the color design of the 1951 film.
Another famous Disney name worked on this attraction as well. Ken Anderson would help Coates paint many of the backgrounds for the original iteration of the attraction. You may remember Anderson from his work on the other Fantasyland attractions we have covered on the show, like Snow White's Scary Adventures, Peter Pan's Flight, and Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. Now keep in mind these artists were used to work on the page with creating their art. I'm going to start that over.
You were used to working on the page. Okay.
Got it.
All right.
Now keep in mind these artists were used to working on the page when creating their art. It was a whole other thing to be creating this art on a massive scale. Coates once said, in regard from going to small cell drawings to large scale renditions, I went from a 12-inch high format to sets that were 18 feet high.
Which has to be a phenomenal shift as an artist, especially one who is formally trained in one very specific medium like animation.
Yes, it's completely different. Also, I've done some set painting for some plays, and there's this whole thing called the 30-foot rule, and scale makes a big difference.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I want to hear more about this 30-foot scale or 30-foot rule one day.
I'll tell you one day.
Yeah, I look forward to that one day.
Great.
They wanted to make that sound as threatening as possible. Oh, man. Okay, Coates...
Go ahead. Go.
No, I'm not going to go anymore. One day.
One day, I'll go.
One day I'll go. Coates and Anderson were like the Fantasyland power duo, much like Annie and I are whenever we go laser tagging.
Ooh.
But yeah, or to Yogurtland.
Our two favorite things.
Put them together, and what do you got? Yogurt tag.
Or barf tag. Because I like to pile my yogurt with so much junk. Oh my gosh.
Laser yogurt. I think that's actually a new thing that should
Laser
be
yogurt.
released. Oh my word, my wife and I would eat pounds of it. So Alice was in essence the product of everything that had already been created with all the attractions that were currently open at that time in the park. They took everything that they had learned from all the other attractions they designed and created in the park and unleashed that new knowledge on Alice in Wonderland. The design would tower over the other attractions, both in design and literally.
What do you mean?
What I mean is this dark ride was the first of its kind in Disneyland to be 2 stories tall.
Oh.
Yeah, it's pretty interesting. Due to the fact that they had run out of room on the ground floor because of Mr. Toad and Peter Pan taking up so much space, the creative team behind Alice had to stack the attraction on top of the other show buildings. Now, in fact, the majority of the show on this attraction takes place on the 2nd floor, right above Mr. Toad's Wild Ride.
The team was also tasked with designing the ride vehicles guests would use to experience the attraction. Claude Coates initially sketched out a ride vehicle that resembled the famous playing cards from the movie, but it was Walt himself who would suggest that guests ride in the Caterpillar instead. And when Walt spoke, it pretty much meant that that was the way it was going to be. So Coates created a Caterpillar sketch, and he would pass it on to Disney, the Disney artist Blaine Gibson, who would sculpt it into a 3D model and send it off to who else? Aero Development.
Of course they would design it. Mm-hmm. 3 years after the park opened, Alice in Wonderland would open on June 14th, 1958. It's interesting to note that another attraction, the sailing ship Columbia, opened on the very same day as well. Folks, if you'd like to know more about the amazing ship and her history, feel free to give a listen to our Sailing Ship Columbia episode. You'll also hear on that episode that Annie's voice is significantly deeper, and I call her Harrison on there, but don't worry about that.
My past life.
Here's a shameless plug. During the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Alice attraction, famous Mouseketeer Karen Pendleton would appear as Alice. Disney put out the following advertisement in honor of the new addition to the Fantasyland lineup. Wait, sorry, I just realized that the shameless plug wasn't during the ribbon cutting. That was the shameless...
Shameless plug. We're going to plug something from 1958. Where Karen Pendleton, just so you know.
We're just doing this off of memory. We don't actually write this stuff. It's just, we're not reading a script right now. Moving on. So here is the article, the following advertisement.
Join Alice in Wonderland, whimsical adventures that beckon inside the rabbit hole. Meet all the astounding characters, the Cheshire Cat, the Mad Hatter, even the oversized chamber and upside-down room. It's all here to delight and thrill you in this outstanding new attraction.
Very well done.
Thank you. Guests would queue up around the corner for the rest from the rest of Fantasyland attractions in a very whimsical, oversized garden, replete with giant blades of green grass, a mountainous mushroom that served as the attraction's ticket booth, and a bevy of daunting dandelions. Guests would board on one of the fleet of Caterpillar ride vehicles and be plunged into the world of Wonderland. These ride vehicles would wind up and down the path, an experience that other dark ride attractions in the area lacked. They simply moved on a single plane. These inclines and declines required the ride vehicles to have 3 wheels instead of the traditional 4 in order to make them more agile.
Just like Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, the attraction has little to do with the source material that we talked about earlier in the episode. Instead, Imagineers used the essence of that source material for the attraction. Lead designer Claude Coates and team created bizarre and somewhat spooky scenes inspired by the film. They did this to create the same kind of feeling that many traveling carnivals created in some of their spooky, dark ride-esque rides. The figures and sets and special effects on the original 1958 Alice were fairly simple and rudimentary. The figures and show scenes guests would interact with were all made out of plywood cutouts that would be painted.
But things wouldn't always stay so two-dimensional in Alice's Wonderland. During the 1983 overhaul of Fantasyland, Alice in Wonderland would receive quite a few updates along with every other inch of the area. David Mumford, a show designer from the new overhaul, said about the update, "We tried to give the color and the mood of the film center stage. In fact, artists working on the attraction took direct inspiration from the vulnerable Mary Blair's work of the singing flowers on the film version of Alice in Wonderland, and they color matched them for the flowers on the attraction." So among various other improvements, Imagineers added 24 fully three-dimensional figures. A new narration would also be added that featured the one and only Catherine Beaumont, the voice of Alice in the Disney classic film. And guests would encounter Alice, the famous caterpillar, and the Queen of Hearts for the first time inside the attraction itself. The audio animatronic version of Alice that the guests saw on the attraction was actually taken from a Walt Disney World attraction by the name of Mickey Mouse Revue. It got such an overhaul, in fact, that Alice in Wonderland would open a year after the rest of the new Fantasyland attractions opened.
But during the 1980s refurbishment, Disney legend Tony Baxter, Imagineer of overseeing the revitalization of Alice, believed that the attraction needed a little bit more of an exciting finale. And when somebody like Tony Baxter makes a suggestion, it's really hard to ignore it. So the team reimagined the ending. Guests would still wind down the leaves, but instead of U-turning back to the loading area, guests would now be treated with one last hurrah by entering into the chaos of the unbirthday scene.
It is good to note that this wasn't a newly imagined show scene. The unbirthday scene already existed on the attraction. Baxter just had it relocated to the end of the attraction. And this moved scene would also make room for the Queen of Hearts and her card minions, though. So it was a very welcome shuffle that he made.
I see. Shuffle, Queen of Heart, cards. Well played, Annie. Well played.
Oh, yeah, I meant to say that.
I'm sure you did. It's not like you were forced to by the genius writing of this section, brought to you by the one and only Roy G. Biv.
Roy G. Biv.
I don't know. It's late, folks.
Oh, well,
late.
If you're Roy G. Biv, then I'm CMYK.
Sorry. Just little inside jokes there. I actually want to back up and talk about the giant vine that riders travel down after they exit the upstairs show area. The vine would prove to be quite the issue over the years of the attraction's existence. The vine platform that the track was laid on was actually really insanely, dangerously narrow. This meant that if there was ever a problem and guests needed to be evacuated from that section of the attraction, it would have been really daunting of a balancing act for guests to get evacuated from that area.
It's surprising that Disney, who is notoriously safety conscious, let this gaping hole in safety just go unaddressed.
Well, in 2010, California OSHA, this is really getting down to the really, really cool stuff. The Department of Safety and Health was visiting the park to address an issue somewhere else in the park. But on the way to that given area of the park, they passed the Alice attraction. One of the investigators noticed the lack of handrails on the outside vine of the attraction and made a comment about the safety concern of that portion of the ride. Well, that offhand comment was all it took for Disney, especially when it comes to OSHA, because holy cow, OSHA is everything in that world. So on July 15th of 2010, the attraction was closed and work on some of that, on some sort of handrail began. The ride reopened with temporary handrails in August of the same year, but a permanent fixture was finally installed during a major attraction refurbishment in 2014. That also brought the needed new lighting effects and update to the show figures. We are exhaustive on this show, folks. If there's an update, we're going to tell you, even if it is just safety handrails on an outside vine.
Yeah, which is so interesting.
That's what people listen for.
Right. Ooh, new handrails on Alice. Oh, I gotta go see those. You know what though? As you were saying that, I was thinking, ooh, I don't think I've seen those new handrails. I gotta go see those. I am that guy. The enhancements though, they with all these, they included a ton of updates for various show scenes. So there is something cool to come out of this.
True.
Digital projection was added, some of which included scenes from the actual film. The Cheshire Cat also got some needed enhancements, which I'd love to see because I'm wondering what those are. They also added a few other Alices to various areas within the attraction. And speaking of Alice being added to all these other areas, it is interesting to note that Alice, or Features of Wonderland, are more represented than any other Disney story property in Fantasyland.
That is actually very interesting.
For instance, you can find her obviously within the attraction and go for a spin on the Mad Tea Party teacups, find keepsakes in the Mad Hatter shop. But you can also see Alice's village on the shores of the famed Storybook Land canal boats, from a boat on the attraction as well as from a train car on Casey Jr. Circus train. And not to mention that Alice is one of the most beloved characters for people to find throughout the park.
Seems like everything's coming up Alice in Fantasyland.
Mm-hmm. I have to say, going to Disneyland as a kid, I always did want to see Alice and Belle. Those were my two favorites.
Those were your go-tos?
Those are my goats.
My...
Oh, wait, that's not a goat.
I'm pretty sure that...
That's my goat.
That sounded more like a chainsaw starting. My two go-tos, my goats, are the churro cart and the ice cream cookie. Those are my two go-tos.
How did I know you were going to say that?
I was always the fat kid that would always get there and be like, I want a picture with Mr. Churro. And I'd be like, who's that? And I'll be like, buy one and I'll show you. And I'd take just a small bite out of the top and be like, look, he's happy now.
I can just imagine you and your family going to Disneyland and everyone being like, all right, we did what Ricky wanted. We did what Mom wanted. All right, Al, what do you want to do? Churro
cart. I wasn't
Churro
alone.
cart.
I wasn't alone on that, Annie. All right. My dad was into it.
Oh, I bet. Papa Rick would be into it.
Rick was. This
Let's
is the
say
first
Papa
time
Stewart, but I feel like that is not what you call him.
I should call him Papa Stew.
You'd love that.
I'm just kidding.
Does he listen to this?
No. Well, yeah, he does, but my parents only listen to it because they love me. Believe it or not, my parents are kind of like Disney. I don't know how that happened. I think that I might have some sort of reckoning with them. One thing that again, famous digression, folks, or infamous digression. The one thing that I'm curious about outside of how they make churros so delicious is the placement of Alice in Wonderland. Because I gotta be honest that I haven't ridden Alice in probably 6 or 7 years. Well, nope, the last time I did it is when my wife and I went on the time that we were visiting the park when we got engaged. So that would have been 6 years ago. So yeah, 6 years was the last time that I've ridden on Alice. When was the last time you rode on it, Annie?
I think the last time I rode on it was not this most recent time I went to Disneyland, but the one before, it's been like a few years.
Okay.
And honestly, I don't ride Alice in Wonderland that often because the lines are horrendous.
They really are bad. Everybody complains about Peter Pan, but I almost feel like Alice might be worse most of the time.
Yes, and it's like right on the pavement, and it's usually in full sunlight.
Yeah, it's not pleasant, to say the least. Well, and again, I don't know, and that's the weird thing, is it's got a huge line, but I don't know how many people who are first-timers to the park even necessarily notice, because it's just so tucked away back in a corner where nobody can really see it.
It is. It's not in the main Fantasyland kind of circle,
No.
as you would say. And you know, like you don't even know it's above Peter Pan, which is kind of crazy now that I know that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Yeah, but you know what I do love about that location?
What?
Is that just down the way there are some really cool Alice in Wonderland themed bathrooms that are
Ooh.
always a treat and rarely packed.
That is true.
So-
That is very true. And they've got a little drinking fountain right there. And I believe that the parade route still goes right down that way. So if you need a little place to pee and parade, right there. One-stop shop,
The two
folks.
P's, they got you. Alice in Wonderland, they got you right there.
Peas on parade. Well, I think that we have digressed plenty, Annie. So should we wrap this episode up?
Yeah, we got just a little bit left to cover. So Alice in Wonderland is a great hidden gem, as we know, on the outskirts of Walt's beloved Fantasyland, but that doesn't make it an outcast. The wild charm and chaotic whimsy of this classic story is what made it an obvious choice for Fantasyland from the very start. And just because it opened 3 years after the rest of the park doesn't mean this attraction was rushed and out of place. It simply reminds us that some of the greatest things in life take a little extra time to come to fruition. So next time you're in the park, make sure you try and visit that cozy little nook right next to those amazing bathrooms around the backside of the castle, and dive down the rabbit hole and into the fantastical world that captivates the young at heart, reminding us that there is no need to rush into adulthood if that means leaving the best parts of our childhood behind.
And that is the history of Alice in Wonderland. Folks, we hope you enjoyed listening to this episode as much as we enjoyed poring over tome after tome of information regarding Alice and her Wonderland.
And if you like what we do here at the Backside of Water, please consider giving us a friendly review on Apple Podcasts.
Also, feel free to give us a follow on Instagram by searching for the Backside of Water podcast. You can also join the fun and growing community on our Facebook group. Also, feel free to check out our sister show, Did You Know Disney, where we discuss topics across the entire Disney spectrum. We will be releasing an episode on that podcast this month as well. And real quick, before we go, one thing that I do want to announce is for those who are longtime listeners who have binged the show, you know that this is around the season where we go dark for a couple of months simply to be able to spend time with family and friends, and that's exactly what we're going to be doing after this episode. So we won't be releasing in November or December, so we can spend time for the holidays with our family and friends, kind of recuperating and enjoying that time. So be prepared for that. We always appreciate that you guys hang in there with us. But we will be giving you the next episode of The Backside of Water, which is going to be actually a mini episode and a full episode. So be prepared for that coming to you at the very beginning of January. So it has been a wonderful year. It's been crazy that we've said goodbye to Harry and said hello to Annie, which we are both grateful for both of their presences on this show. And we want to extend a very special, warm holiday wishes to all of you in a very early and preemptive way. We appreciate the gift of your friendship and of your listenership through this crazy journey that we've been going on for over 3 years now. So thank you very much, folks.
Yeah, thank you so much. And we hope you enjoy your holidays with your friends and family, and that you take some time as well to just be present with them.
I grow up, I'm going to do a podcast.
Oh, when you grow up, you're going to be a podcaster? So,
Jackson.
full disclosure, it's 11:30 p.m., folks. My wife is fast asleep, and my son just walked out. And he decided to tell everybody. I don't know if you guys heard that or not, but
shared his cute little voice.
He said, tell everybody what you want to do when you grow up.
Be a cat podcast.
He wants to be a podcaster. That's what he says. So I'm going to go put this kid to bed. Annie, let's wrap this up. What do you say?
I agree, Al. So as you exit, just watch your head and watch your step.
And if you happen to miss your step and hit your head, please watch your language. Goodbye.